Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is where I look exclusively at films on 3D Blu-ray, not to do a movie review, but to focus almost entirely on the film's 3D, with just a short word at the end about the film itself, and this time I'm looking at Comin at Ya. It's got a very wide aspect ratio. It's not stated on the Blu-ray box, but I think it comes in at about 2.55 to 1, and being from 1981, this was obviously shot in native 3D. This is the film that didn't just kick off the ripple of 1980s 3D films, but it kicked it in the face by dialing the 3D up as far as it would go, and then frequently pushing it some way beyond that. This is packed with fairly outrageous 3D, and depending on your point of view, some of this stuff is either excellent or rather ridiculous. So right from the beginning, during a surprisingly inventive opening credit sequence, they set out their stall with plenty of the type of 3D that the film has to offer, and that's to say, extremely strong and fairly gratuitous. And so, like his knife here, the 3D is going to be dangerously unsheathed and coming at you hard and strong. The snake here is in very strong negative parallax, and I think is maybe just about on the threshold of what your eyes and brain can process into a three-dimensional image, but the film definitely doesn't always stay on the right side of those limits. Being a Western, there are going to be a lot of pistols and rifles poking a long way out of the screen, and sometimes they get away with it, but a few times they don't. And I'm sure anyone listening here fully understands this, but as an extreme simplification, the further apart the lenses are on a 3D camera, then the stronger the 3D will be. But there comes a point when they're too far apart relative to the proximity of whatever they're filming, and at that point the 3D effect collapses, and people complain about eye strain. So when, for example, your left eye can only see the right side of this pole, and your right eye can only see its left side, in other words, it's pointed directly in between your eyes, then the left and right eye views become so totally unrelated that there's no possible hope of resolving them into a unified three-dimensional image. There are plenty of shots where the camera setup captures the strong 3D perfectly well, like with the sword here, but they'll often then just push it until the sword's so close that it goes beyond the point of what works. Another thing 3D filmmakers have to think about in a way that 2D filmmakers don't is the way that they edit, and that wasn't an area where this film always did a great job either, as they'll often cut from an extreme bit of negative parallax, like yet another hokey piece of 3D here with the scorpion being held out towards us, and when they cut to this shot you might immediately see her as a double image, as your eyes are still crossed from the previous shot and they could take a moment to realign themselves. When a load of other things are thrust way too far out of the screen, I suppose it does have the desired effect of making you flinch, like the spear throwing here, but I do think that what's causing you to flinch is less down to a great moment of pop-out, but more down to an involuntary spasm as a result of your eyes being twisted beyond their natural limits. And when the film has an effect like the spear being thrown, they won't just do it once or twice, but they'll keep on and on throwing them at you multiple times. Same thing with the flaming arrows, shot after shot, and I think I counted something like 10 bats flying towards the camera into tight close-up, and the inclusion of the bat scene, just because it was an opportunity for some wild 3D, was so daft that I lost track of whether the old bouncing a rubber bat up and down on a piece of string routine looks stupid or good. I think that actually looks quite good, but they might have just bamboozled me with all their batty absurdity. Now, like I said, you'd reasonably expect to see gun barrels, spears, and flaming arrows in a Western, so their presence is easily justifiable. But how about this fella here doing a handy bit of paddle batting? This is in a sequence that in terms of its 3D is obviously referencing House of Wax, but in terms of the film itself, this scene feels like it's aiming more for a Once Upon a Time in the West vibe, maybe not completely succeeding, and partly because the egregious 3D keeps getting in the way. If the paddle bat shot wasn't enough, let's have this chap doing a spot of impromptu yo-yoing, and when his little yo-yo reaches its apogee, the left eye view of it is on the far right side of the screen, and the right eye view is way over on the far left. It's just impossible to fuse such a massive amount of parallax into anything other than a cross-eyed mess. I think the most ludicrous shot in this sequence though, and I assume it was put in simply as some sort of airplane-style visual gag in 3D, but we for some reason cut to this view of an onion being peeled. This shot's actually quite restrained, as whilst it's extremely strong 3D, I don't think it was pushed beyond the limits of what can be successfully viewed in 3D. Also, unbelievably, it might not even be the most incongruous shot in the film, as there's another moment that I'm not even going to show here, because these days it could probably get me arrested, but there's a bit where a baby's bare bottom is shoved into your face. Now, in fairness, they did call the film Comin at Ya for a reason, and it's not just because the lead character's coming out for the villain. However, whilst the 3D here is frequently pretty farcical, and sometimes far too strong to actually work, and it totally gets in the way of the storytelling, I do reckon that if you were to trim maybe just a couple of minutes out of the film, you could get rid of most of the more objectionably preposterous 3D shots, and if you did that, I think what you'd be left with is plenty of genuinely excellent 3D, and that's because, in spite of all its nonsense, I think this film was actually rather brilliantly put together in terms of its 3D design. It's absolutely packed with properly magnificent 3D production design, and when it's not obsessed with its conspicuous intrusions into negative space and flagrant abuse of your eyeballs, it actually delivers loads of really sumptuous 3D views. There's a scene that plays out in this location which has been expertly staged in both the placement of a huge number of props as well as the placement of the camera, and it looks really good, and shot after shot is set up for non-gimmicky, lovely looking 3D, with many of the scenes being full of depth and detail, all full of space and separation. This really does show that they knew exactly how to make an excellent 3D presentation, and for the most part that's what they did. They just couldn't quite ignore that little devil's voice that kept saying, "It's time to poke them in the face again, do it more, do it again and again and again." And I think that's why this film ends up being thought of more as a notorious example of contrived 3D, rather than being celebrated for its well-crafted and deep stereo compositions, which is what represents the majority of its running time. Maybe occasionally the framing is a little bit heavy-handed to show off the 3D, like the really obvious placement of stuff in the foreground here, but that's something that I think that Hitchcock was guilty of too, so no shame in the few setups that do that. But for the most part, the film is designed with a richly filled Z-axis, and coupling that with its bold 3D, it mostly looks fantastic. But for good or bad, I do think it's best remembered for its 3D nonsense. So as well as all those guns and spears and arrows, not forgetting the paddle bat, yo-yo and onion peel coming out of the screen, add to that the bats and rats and bunny rabbits, and basically anything and everything they can possibly get hold of to poke you in the face with, they will. Like, here's a ladle that just keeps on coming out of the screen, and the movie is packed full of things being poured down towards the camera, like coffee beans, grapes and gold coins. They're just some of the very many shots that would make the film look completely bizarre to anyone watching it in 2D, not knowing its extra-dimensional origins. I guess that's the case with most of the 80s 3D films, but it's not remotely the case with almost all of the digital era 3D films. Reaching hands are another common one here, and sometimes pushed beyond what your brain can work with, but here's one that's a bit reminiscent of Dial M for Murder, the girl's hand reaching out of the screen in a desperate plea for help. It's effective, and it even manages to be a moment where the 3D is working on an emotional level, and I do think there are some other examples of that, like the couple in bed here, and I don't mean this to sound presumptuous or rude, but they might possibly look like a bit of an unlikely match, and that's because she's very much an unwilling partner here, and in this shot, I honestly think the 3D, just through its strength of space and the power it brings to facial expressions, it's kind of superb in emphasising her fear and repulsion and his gruesome desires. So I'm actually saying that I think Comin at Ya has some truly classy uses of 3D going on, and maybe best of all, the strength of the 3D deepens these people's faces, which helps this shot to make them feel like a bunch of grotesques, which is what they are, as this is a sequence where this lot are bidding on kidnapped women being sold into prostitution. Anyway, I think it's another one of the film's examples of top quality drama heightening uses of 3D. And the same guys who made this film, including its star Tony Antony and the director Ferdinando Baldi, also made the 3D film Treasure of the Four Crowns a couple of years years later, and I believe that the 3D Film Archive has been working on a restoration of that film, and it's a bit of a shame that they weren't involved in Comin preparation for this release. So when it comes to 3D restoration, the 3D Film Archive, with I think just a really small team of dedicated experts, they've been doing the Lord's work with their exquisite and frankly miraculous work in getting the absolute best out of poor quality elements on maybe a couple of dozen older 3D films now, but sadly this one didn't go through them, and it does have some technical defects. I think the worst of which is the very frequent dirt that's visible. This isn't flickering on a frame by frame basis, but it's the same dirt patterns throughout the film, like it was on the lenses or mirror or prisms or scanner or whatever. But whatever its origins were, marks like this, and this one here is probably the worst shot for it in the film, they're far, far worse on a 3D film because of the discrepancies between the left and right eye, so these quite badly draw attention to themselves. Also, I don't know if it was for the Blu-ray release or an earlier restoration, but for some reason they decided to give the film more of a modern look, or modern by the standards of whenever Sin City came out, by throwing several shots into black and white, but maintaining some colour within the frame. Whilst I quite like this look, there's probably reason enough to object to it, as it's not in keeping with the film's original release, but also because in shots like this, the rotoscoping to select the area to be kept in colour is usually on a subject where there's the biggest parallax shift, so it can have the effect of making the 3D almost look fake at times. Ultimately, I'd probably rather they'd spent some effort cleaning up the film rather than doing this digital colour tinkering. It's kind of interesting that this film predated Friday the 13th Part 3 by about a year, and there are an uncanny number of shots in the latter film similar to this one. So both films feature an irrelevant yo-yo that we've already seen, as well as a snake, and there's also a pitchfork shoved towards us, as well as the almost tiresomely long shot here of its handle coming closer and closer to us and being thrust out of the screen. There's a bit with an axe, someone hanging on a rope. I mean, some of these are obvious shots for a 3D film, I suppose, but coincidentally or intentionally, there do seem to be more similarities than you'd expect, and the most bizarre of which is probably both films having a rodent walking out of the screen on a stick, which isn't really an obvious shot for any film. The film goes out on an explosive finale, so it ends with a bang, but also with a surprisingly ineffective piece of 3D by its own standards, so that feels maybe like a mild letdown after all of the stereoscopic extremities that it had been pushing up until then. So just a very quick word about the film itself. It's a spaghetti western with a simple rescue and revenge story. The main character is named H.H. Hart, and bearing in mind that he's played by Tony Anthony, I assume that the character's full name is Hart. The lead actress, Victoria Abril, is very pretty, and she seems to be game to get roughed up and thrown around quite a bit. It's extremely light on dialogue, which I guess could be called a pure form of cinema, and it's certainly in keeping with the genre. I thought it was a pretty good looking film, nicely designed and shot. Maybe the acting wouldn't have caught the attention of the Oscar voting panel, but I thought all of the performances seemed spot on for the type of film they were making, and I thought Tony Anthony had a likability about him. Films with exclamation marks in the title are often winners for some reason. I already mentioned the classic Airplane coincidentally, and then there's Oliver, Help, Three Amigos in that select group, then again there's also Mamma Mia, so maybe that piece of punctuation in the title isn't so much of a guarantee after all. Anyway, it's not a long film and it never gets boring. I don't mean to say that it's really in any way a good film as such, but it's certainly good fun, and I do admit to having a real soft spot for it. It does have, if not exactly an important place in the history of 3D films, it certainly has a very significant one, and ultimately I'd definitely say that Comin is a must-have Blu-ray for 3D fans. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for a look at another 3D Blu-ray. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.